Today's procurement teams have to meet a dizzying array of internal and external challenges. They must be responsive and risk resistant. They must respect and even improve the environment and be as inclusive as possible. They must serve the needs of internal buyers, global suppliers, and the bottom line. And perhaps most importantly, they must achieve all of this seamlessly and efficiently. But the foundation for procurement success, and I think its future impact, is data. And yet, using accurate data to drive decision making remains one of our greatest challenges. And so, we partnered with Sievo and Buyers Meeting Point to take a deep dive into procurement data ecosystems. In this special series, Kelly Barner and I will explore how procurement leaders can meet their analytical requirements while also exploiting the full cross-functional value of data. Data that serves as the foundation for enabling corporate growth and competitive advantage. And so every 2 weeks between April and July 2021, Kelly and I will speak with senior level executives at Risk Methods, Basware, Supplier.io, EcoVadis, and Sievo, companies at the forefront of the procurement data revolution. All of the episodes in this series, in addition to an ebook that accompanies the series and that is written by Kelly, can be found at artofprocurement.com/data series. That's artofprocurement.com/data series. And so in this first episode, I speak to Sammalkorpi, the CEO and co-founder of Sievo. Sammeli and I lay the foundations. We discuss the differences between spend analysis and spend analytics, tips for scoping and making the case for investment in advanced data capabilities. And we discuss some of the behind-the-scenes mechanics, such as data lakes. Finally, Sammeli shares why he thinks that we need to be thinking about data from that ecosystem perspective. So let's go into the show, where I ask Sammeli if he found procurement or if procurement found him.
That's a great question. Let me actually take a step back. Sort of, if you ask my parents what they hoped me to become, when I was born, our family was living in northern Finland in Lapland, and they wanted me to become a reindeer farmer.
Right.
So it didn't actually go that way. So I have not met my parents' expectations. But to answer your question, I guess it's procurement who found me. So soon after my university graduation, I was working as a consultant and ended up working in procurement consulting projects and got pretty excited about that. So that's how me and procurement met.
So there's still time to become a reindeer farmer, though. So don't give up on the dream yet.
That is actually true, but at least from kind of commercial point of view, I think I start to be on a better side, because the reindeer farming is not a huge business in Finland, and I think next year the Sievo's revenue will exceed the combined revenue of reindeer farming business in Finland. So it seems it was the right choice, at least.
Yeah, seems primed for transformation, if nothing else.
That is true. That is true.
So really in this series, we want to do a deep dive into data in procurement. It's a topic that obviously it's so important. And when we speak to CPOs and procurement leaders at Art of Procurement, it comes to the top of the list all the time of procurement challenges. So we want to do a bit of a deep dive into data and what procurement leaders can really do to get access to more impactful data and obviously turn those into insights. As we start to think about that, the first question I have is actually just more from a terminology perspective. We've heard a lot about spend analysis over the years, and that being a thing to focus on for procurement. But we're now hearing more about procurement analytics and procurement analytics platforms. So I just wonder if you could speak to kind of the two, and when those terms are used, what's the difference between the two?
Yeah, I think that's a kind of great question, and procurement has for a long time leveraged spend analysis technologies. But I think if you look at the mandate of procurement, perhaps let's say 5-10 years ago, it was all about kind of spend, reducing costs, creating savings for shareholders. But if you look at the wider mandate that procurement now has, managing supplier risk, managing diversity, managing sustainability, managing supplier innovation and collaboration, so the mandate of procurement has gotten wider. And by the same token, the analytical needs of procurement are not only kind of spend focused anymore, but good analytics platform for procurement needs to cater both for spend and for these, let's say, other domains of procurement. So in my head, at least, sort of spend analysis is, yes, you still need to understand spend by categories and suppliers, but procurement analytics addresses a wider set of use cases.
Mm. As you're thinking about those broader use cases, what's the kind of data that a procurement leader should expect to be able to have access to?
Yeah, and that's really good question, because if you think of spend data, that data is typically within your own internal ERP systems and procurement systems. That's the data you
Yeah.
get from SAPs and Oracles. But the more you start to go to these, let's say, more novel domains, be that supplier diversity, be that risk, be that sustainability, a lot of that data is best available through external sources, be that, let's say, public data in internet, but also more specifically being different kind of data providers that are focused on these different aspects. You have
Hmm.
EcoVadis for sustainability, you have risk models for risk, and so forth. So from procurement analytics point of view, what the procurement leaders need to do is to acquire this external data, but then also build the capabilities to combine this internal data, spend data, with that external data,
Right.
to not only understand, for example, you have a risk with supplier A, but actually understand how much business value you have at risk because of that situation.
So as you think about all those different data sources, where and bringing those together into more of a kind of an end-to-end platform, that procurement analytics platform, where should that live relative to some of the other technologies in procurement that an organization may have, whether that's ERP, whether it's a P2P, whether it's source to contract? There's such an abundance of different platforms you can have. Where should that data sit?
Yeah. First of all, I think 5 years ago, 10 years ago, the common line of thinking is that eventually there'll be one full suite that caters for all procurement needs of large companies. But we have seen that it's not happening. It's failing. It's failing
Hmm.
both because perhaps the failure to, let's say, meet the expectations by these, let's say, suite providers, but also, and perhaps more importantly, because there's just so much innovation in procurement software space right now.
Yeah.
So I think the reality for any company is that there will be multiple operational applications, and that plus the external data sources, there will be a huge number of relevant data sources for procurement. And then if you want to really get the benefit of analytics, you need to have the capability to collect data from these internal and external sources. So at least in my head, sort of this procurement analytics by design needs to be something, kind of a separate entity that connects to these other internal and external data sources.
Hmm.
And now this procurement analytics, I think nowadays everything will be in cloud, so it will be in cloud for sure. And then also I think it probably needs to be a combination of procurement analytics specific solutions, but also different kind of data feeds to, let's say, wider corporate data lakes, because
Hmm.
also most IT organizations nowadays are creating a data lake for corporate purposes.
You talked about kind of the explosion of um, what you may consider best of breed, or just
Mhm.
money coming into the technology space from a software perspective. It's something we track, and actually, by the time this episode goes live, we'll have launched our kind of tech map, and we're tracking over 300 companies,
Mhm.
tech companies supporting procurement right now, and it's exploding every single
Yeah.
week because the money is coming into this space
Mhm.
like never before. And so you now have options to do all these different things with all these different individual
Exactly.
providers. And like you say, ultimately that has to come together somewhere.
Yeah.
Um, but it doesn't mean that you go to one place to get everything.
Yeah.
It's just
Yeah.
really interesting to see how the technology space in procurement is evolving. Um,
I absolutely agree. And when we started Sievo like 15, 18 years ago, there wasn't a lot of, let's say, procurement innovation in place. But if I look at the situation right now, there's a lot of money flowing in.
yeah.
There's a lot of innovative startups. There's just so much happening in the space, which means that will drive the, let's say, frontier of what's possible in procurement tech side. But also by the same token, it will create multiple different data sources for
Mhm.
procurement organizations.
Why would you say that getting a handle on data and data analytics has been such a hard problem for procurement organizations to actually tackle so far?
Yeah, I think it's good. It's difficult because at least from
Yeah.
Sievo's point of view, that creates us a business opportunity. But
Yeah.
I think there's a kind of a couple reasons for that. I think the first reason is that most of the sort of procurement software providers are just not focused on that. They are more focused on transactional P2P. They are more focused on operational processes, be that sourcing or contract authoring or stuff like that. There really hasn't been a lot of focus on procurement analytics specifically. And the
Hmm.
hard part of the analytics and data is that while e-sourcing tool, you can, let's say, design a perfect e-sourcing tool. When it comes to analytics, it will be always based on the data assets that the client has.
Hmm.
And those data assets will be always customer specific, and those data assets will be always dirty as well. So
Yeah.
if you really want to create good analytics, you need to build it based on the assumption of client specific data sets. You need to build it on based on assumption of dirty data. And then you need to have these people who both understand business needs, what sort of analytics really are useful or not, and then at the same time you need to have people who deep down understand, stuff like when there's a good received sort of step taking place in SAP or Oracle, where does the data flow? And
Hmm.
it's really actually kind of hard to combine these different kind of capabilities within one individual or even within a small team. So it is fundamentally a difficult challenge to tackle.
Now, do you see that you obviously work with a lot of organizations who have this challenge and are overcoming this challenge because you're helping them to do that. Now, those that are the most successful, how much of a responsibility are they taking for the quality of the data as opposed to it kind of um, I guess I'll say complaining, but complaining about the fact that it's a hard problem to solve for because the organization has bad data. Kind of that realization that there is something that we as procurement leaders can do about it, and it's not just some bigger problem that we don't have that much influence over.
Yeah, and I think sort of kind of uh, my thinking on that topic is that I see a lot of organizations sort of exactly complaining like our data is so bad that we can't do a meaningful analysis.
Hmm.
But I think, and then the answer quite often sort of seems to be that okay, let's start the master data improvement process. But I think that's wrong way to think about that because data has couple of, let's say, very unusual qualities compared to other assets. First of all, the more you use data, the better it will get. So I would argue that the right way to deal with the data quality problem is to just start using that for different kind of, let's say, procurement analytical purposes. And when
Hmm.
you expose that data to end users, then you start to have, let's say, natural demand for better data. So take the bad data you have, use it for the analytics, get the feedback from the end users, and then establish the feedback loops to kind of get the data better. So that's how you need to think about the bad quality data.
Hmm.
Expose that and start improving that. And
There's something that.
yeah,
Sorry, go ahead, Sammeli.
the second unusual quality of the data is that sort of when you have different kind of data assets and you have the capability to combine them, suddenly 1 + 1 = 3. So the more data assets that you can put together and start to leverage sort of the correlations and insights created through combination of the data assets, you start to get more value. And therefore,
Mhm.
you need to have this one procurement information hub where you collect the different procurement data.
Yeah, and one of the things you said just at the beginning there, which resonated with me, is as you think about it from a practitioner side, often we get hold of this data and we start presenting this data to our stakeholders, but we're presenting it as fact, and they might look at it and say, "Well, that's not true," and they lose the trust that they have in data that we present in the future. So perhaps the most effective way is to go kind of transparently say, "We're just starting to get a handle around this data. Help us improve it," and that might lead
Exactly.
to a better conversation.
Exactly, and one mistake a lot of companies do is that they get this sort of bad data, then they use months or quarters or years to get it in shape, and when they believe it's in shape, they go and present to stakeholders, and it's going to be wrong anyways. So
Hmm.
you used months and you lost the trust. The right approach is to expose it as quickly as possible, and exactly as you state, sort of say, this is the first hang, please help us improve this data.
Yeah.
And then you win time, but then you also kind of create a process where the credibility and trust is won.
Right. Now, within Sievo, you recently announced different ways to connect different types of data, that third-party data that you talked about, into your analytics. I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about kind of the thinking there and the value that you're hoping that that provides to procurement organizations.
Sure. So as mentioned, there's more and more both, let's say, procurement software providers that are focused on certain specific domain, be that on supplier risk or be that on diversity or something like that, but also an increasing number of data providers who provide commodity data or supplier ratings and so forth. So the data is available, and it is easy to acquire that data by any organization.
Mm-hmm.
So pure data access will not be enough to kind of differentiate yourself from the competition. The challenge, however, and where the companies can create a competitive advantage, that the challenge is that okay, getting the data from those providers is seemingly easy. Everybody says they have an API and just connect to API and take the data. And yes, kind of getting the data is easy. But
Yeah.
then you start to have the real challenges. In your ERP, you are calling vendors with certain names and numbers. In the external data sources, it's different numbering and naming systems. Same goes for materials and categories and basically for all the data. So somehow you need to create the process where you get all of this data, but you also match it against each other. So that at the end of the day, you can not only say my supplier has a risk, but actually it's this much spend, these products will be impacted, and this is how much business value I have at risk. So
Mm-hmm.
it's that data acquisition, but also data matching challenge that large procurement companies need to solve. And just the provider saying, hey, we have an API, it's a starting point. It's not the full solution to
Mm-hmm.
creating this sort of data platform.
Now, I want to talk a little bit about kind of building the case for why we should be thinking as procurement leaders again of going down this route of investing in procurement analytics.
Mm.
And I think one of the challenges that we often have is that um, centralized decision making by IT.
Yeah.
You know, IT will say, "I own the data, I own the tech stack related to
Mm.
data." That's very nice what you might want, but
Mm.
hey, we're taking care of that. And, you know, that might be in 2 years' time or 3 years'
Mm.
time or
Yeah.
whatever, but,
Mm.
you know, kind of stand off. So I wonder if you could give a little bit of advice for, you know, how a procurement leader can
Mm.
actually make a case to
Mm.
look at an investment in data on a procurement level as opposed to just kind of waiting for some centralized IT decision making.
Yeah. The way I've seen sort of our clients and smart procurement people going around is that the IT ones, for legitimate reasons, they want to build, let's say, corporate data lake, and I don't
Mm-hmm.
think that's something that procurement can or should sort of oppose. So I would say it's not opposing that, but it's actually complementing that. The
Mm-hmm.
first reality is so there will be a corporate data lake. The second reality for most organizations, unfortunately, is that when the corporate IT is building the data lake, procurement is not the priority number one or two or three. So it
Right.
will indeed take 2 or 5 or 20 years before procurement gets there. And that's something I don't think procurement needs to accept. So typically, the advice I would give is that um, convince the IT that there is some procurement-specific analytic challenges that can be solved by let's say third-party providers. That's the
Mm-hmm.
first step. The second step is that you need to position this as complementary to data lake, which typically means that you need to have information exchanges between this data lake and the procurement specific sort of uh, solution. So that the IT can still create this corporate data lake that has all data, including procurement data, enriched by, let's say, procurement specific analytical applications.
Mm-hmm.
So you need to play a complementary play rather than, let's say, opposing play. And when you have those two components in place, actually you quite often can get okay from the IT, because also for the IT they are struggling with the resources, and they will need to fulfill the needs of marketing and sales and HR and supply chain and procurement and so forth. So if procurement can come up with the proposal saying, yes, you can still have your data lake, but we will solve this subset of your challenges of or our challenges with the complementary approach that feeds data back to data lake, then I think it's a true win-win for procurement and IT.
Mm-hmm. Now, this may seem like a simple question, and a lot of listeners are probably think it is a simple question, but I just want to know from a terminology perspective as well, and for those not familiar with the term. But can you just talk a little bit more about enterprise data lakes?
Yeah.
What that entails, what it looks like, what feeds into it, just for context as much as anything else.
Yeah, sure, Phil. So basically, I think that's perhaps the biggest, let's say, mega trend in analytics overall, not just kind of procurement, but analytics overall. And I think sort of probably sort of also the listeners are aware that sort of the Amazon AWS and Microsoft Azure Cloud are the kind of the new ecosystems where all the software pretty much will eventually live. And within these sort of cloud providers, there's also, let's say, specific approaches for how to build analytics and how to kind of work with data. And sort of the new concept, which is being, let's say, heavily invested by IT across all companies, is the concept of data lakes. And the idea is that the data from different kind of sources, from internal sources and external sources, is collected and placed in the data lake.
Mm-hmm.
You almost copy all the data from your SAP and Oracles to that data lake, and then you build different kind of analytical applications on top of that data in the data lake, with the idea that once you have all the data in the same place, then you can create new kind of analytics and insights on top of that.
I appreciate you giving them the kind of level setting, because as much for my benefit, probably as listeners, because I wanted to jump off of that then to talk about scoping procurement analytics. So, we talked about the benefit of looking at analytics from a procurement specific lens versus a enterprise IT lens, and trying to make the case to do so. If you're a procurement leader and you're looking to start scoping out an enterprise procurement analytics requirement, how do you start to go about that? What do you include in it? What's important? What's not so important?
Yeah, kind of. And I would say the spend analysis needs to be at the center of that sort of design for two reasons. The first reason is that spend analysis is important in itself. It sort of provides one of the basic fundamental use cases that you have, so you should have that in place. But also for a second reason, and I refer to spend analysis as the magic glue that can glue together the internal and external data.
Yeah.
Because with the spend data, okay, this supplier is used for these categories in these countries, sort of stuff. So the spend data contains the links between suppliers and categories and your business units. So when you start to have the external data, be that supplier risk or be that commodity prices, you can contextualize that external data by linking the supplier risk score to category information or regional information through the spend data that you have. So I would first create the spend analysis, and then I would start to address the other use cases around that. Then which exact use cases you want to focus, I think that's very business and context specific. For some companies, working capital may be the priority number one. We see a lot of our clients heavily investing in sustainable procurement analytics right now, so we are working in that domain. In US, supplier diversity is a big topic. So the only advice I would start from spend analytics and then start to address the use cases around that.
Now, as you start to get the data, you get access from a technological perspective to usable data. How is technology helping drive insights from that, and how much is it, training, having people on your team who can actually do that, take the data and put it into practice? I'd just love to know kind of your view on the role of technology versus the human element, and on making that data ultimately impactful.
Yeah, I think that's sort of great question. Sort of my line of thinking is that everything that can be automated will be automated, and I'll provide some concrete examples soon. But at the same time, I think we are still very far from a situation where sort of analytical applications can really sort of overtake human decision making in strategic sourcing or category management. So for the foreseeable future, it will be very much a sort of human machine collaboration that sort of creates the value. And to make it a bit more concrete, sort of 10 years ago, 15 years ago, the best practice of procurement analytics was pretty much sort of a static report that you get, you get that. Over the last 5-10 years, we've moved to, let's say, online analytics where you can drill down and slice and dice the data in different ways. What's happening right now, and that's great, but it still requires a lot of, let's say, human attention to go to log into software, find out the data, and find out the insights. I think where we are heading now is sort of alert up mentality. So instead of drill down, you alert up. There's software algorithms that go through the data and they highlight and provide you with insights. And then your role as a user is to sort of either accept the insight as interesting one or decline it as a non-interesting one. It's almost like Tinder for procurement opportunities. You get opportunities, you swipe right or left, but that feedback then also helps the system to train itself what sort of insights Phil likes, and therefore feeds you only with those ones. So a kind of human is still required, but sort of the automation accelerates the process. And perhaps after some more years, there's so much human feedback that the machine gets confident enough that, okay, whenever certain criteria is filled, we should automatically act on these insights. So I think sort of we are closing the data to action gap through machine learning, AI, software algorithms, but for the next few years, there definitely will be human approving element involved still.
Yeah. What's interesting about some of the things you say there is, you think about outside of procurement, and you see this obviously being, in a leadership role when you see across the entire business, on the sales and the marketing perspective, these kind of technologies have been available for a long time, and yes, they're getting smarter, but we're really applying things that already exist. So to say, it's not that we're that we're innovating something completely new. We're applying innovation to a new category, and that category is procurement. So there should be confidence from folks who are listening and thinking about the things that we're talking about, that the use cases already exist outside of procurement. I'd just love to know your kind of perspective on what you're taking from the outside versus what's completely new, because it feels like there's a lot of things that exist outside, but like I say, we're just applying it to procurement for the first time now.
No, I think that there's a lot of truth to that sort of kind of. I think historically there's been massively more investments in sales and marketing tech that there has been in procurement tech. I think sort of that's changing right now. But as a consequence, also sort of it is indeed that on sales marketing side, there's much more automation going on compared to what is happening on the procurement side. And I think in some ways procurement is now catching up and leveling up and leveraging data and technologies also on the buy side.
Yeah, I see it as really exciting. Having, you see what the art of the possible is from sales and the marketing side, applying that to procurement. I think there is so much opportunity, and you think about where we may be in 3 years or 5 years or 10 years time, and I don't think it's hype anymore when we start talking about what the art of the possible is. So now, one of the things I'm going to introduce a new term now to listeners, because the series is really all about diving into procurement data ecosystems. And we haven't yet talked about what a data ecosystem is and what it is in the context of procurement. So I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that. What is a procurement data ecosystem?
Yeah, definitely. And let me start by sharing a reflection. Sort of typically, let's say procurement is seen or the role of the procurement is seen as providing, let's say, cost reduction and financial benefits for the company, and that is one way to frame procurement, and I think it's still valid. But I think the emerging way to additionally frame the procurement is to frame procurement as a key interface between the company and the upstream ecosystem. Because when you really think about that, there's two functions in company who are kind of exposed drastically to external ecosystem. There's the sales and marketing on the, let's say, downstream side, and there's the procurement on the upstream side. So if we accept that procurement is one of the key interfaces between company and the outside ecosystem, and if you also accept that the data is the new oil, conclusion is that one of the ways we should frame procurement is that it should be in the role of, let's say, data acquisition, data processing. That's the role of the procurement. And if you think of that way, then the next conclusion is that, okay, how can procurement manage and benefit from the data ecosystem around it? Yes, you have your invoices and purchase orders within the company, but there's so much data outside related to suppliers, commodities, countries, whatnot,
Hmm.
that procurement really needs to leverage this data and nurture this data ecosystem to its benefit. So what the dialogues I'm having really with CPOs is, okay, what is the specific data ecosystem that's relevant for your company, and
Yeah.
how can you leverage that for your benefit? Too often, still, sort of the supply market intelligence, for example, it's practically it's a Google and an analyst, but
Hmm.
has much more scalable ways of doing that that companies should leverage.
And so if we think about that in the context of data lakes that we talked
Mhm.
about earlier, so would this be additive in terms of, are you bringing data into from the outside to add to an internal data lake, or are you keeping two separate um, lakes, if you will, of
Yeah.
data? One just happens to be third party and one is internal, and then through procurement analytics software, you're bringing those two together into the same place.
Yeah. So yeah, and I think for me, eventually all the data needs to be, all procurement data needs to go to one procurement analytics platform. And
Hmm.
there's sort of the technical layer, which is for me sort of the data lakes and how do you manage that. But then there's this sort of more business layer, which is sort of understanding the data ecosystem around you, what sort of data sources you have, suppliers, market research, internet, data providers, software providers, and so forth, and then how you can leverage those different data providers to your
Hmm.
advantage.
Yeah, so there's you thinking from there can be external data feeds, but it could be alerts. Let's say a Google alert on something that's happening somewhere that informs
Yeah,
you with a supplier, bringing all that together so that as a user you're seeing all that in the same place at the same time and you're able to action it.
exactly. And there's the kind of usability point of view. As a user, you want to have one procurement information hub, but
Yeah.
then also from the insight creation point of view, only by bringing these different data elements together, you can create new insights which are based on combination of data points.
Now, if I bring that back to the IT folks again, you know, is that something that they're used to? Are they? Is that in the mindset of an IT data architect when they're looking at something from an enterprise perspective, of bringing outside data in as well, or is that still a little bit of a change management responsibility on us to talk about these external sources of data that we want to bring in, as well as what exists within the four walls of the business?
Yeah. I think conceptually, I think most IT architecture folks get that. But then on practical level, I think there's sort of a information bias, because typically the IT people are very well aware of the internal data assets because they are very
Yeah.
close to ERPs and stuff like that. But how much does an average IT person understand about procurement specific data ecosystem and data sources? Probably quite little.
Hmm.
So in that sense, I think that's one of the roles that procurement can and should play, is to be informed about these external data sources to understand how they could be used for let's say procurement's benefit.
Hmm. Now, I have following off on that, then a question that's again more about process and organizational design than it is about the data
Mm.
itself. Um, do you recommend that procurement groups themselves start to look for, not necessarily just folks who are data literate, but data scientists, people
Mm.
who can do the architecting from a procurement perspective, or is that going a little bit over the top? What are you seeing those that are having the most success doing in terms
Yeah.
of their own internal skill set and knowledge about data?
Yeah. Yeah. I have a sort of kind of shorthand or analog here that I find very helpful. How many procurement organizations have software engineers within their teams?
Hmm.
Very, very few.
Yeah.
And I think in the same way, is this kind of data science, it's a very specific competence, and I doubt that procurement functions should have that capability within their teams. And why is that? It's for a number of the reasons. The capability of procurement functions to attract, entertain, and retain such talent will be challenging.
Hmm.
It's perhaps the role which is most sought after globally right now. So even if you want, can you really? But then also I think sort of like 10, 15 years ago, companies were still building their own ERPs. They had in-house software teams developing ERPs, but all of that has gone to cloud and third-party providers. Nobody in their right mind is starting a project to create new company-specific ERPs, but you just purchase it from the cloud.
Yeah.
Same will happen to analytics. You will be purchasing that from the cloud. You are not investing, or you shouldn't be investing in that as an in-house team. So short answer is no, you should not.
Well, Sanneli, I want to thank you so much, first of all, for joining us to talk a little bit about procurement data ecosystems and how to think about procurement analytics, and the difference between traditional spend analysis and procurement analytics. As we start to wrap up, I got one last question for you, and that's, if you're thinking about listeners today, procurement leaders who they recognize the importance of data, they know that they have to do more. They're not really sure where to start, and they're afraid of making decisions now that will tie them down for over the long term, and turn out to be in a year's time or 2 years' time, and they may look back and regret just based on how technology's evolved. So my question is kind of, what advice would you give to them on how to improve the use of data and analytics while still being able to remain kind of fast and that flexibility to change over time?
Great question. I think there's three pieces of advice. The first one is that start using the data. You can't do master data management for all data in the world. You just need to grab the data and start using that and create the feedback loops to make it better. So that's the only way you can actually kind of get some action. So that would be the first one. The second one would be that position your procurement analytics as complementary to, let's say, corporate data lakes. If you wait to corporate IT to bring the procurement solution, you will be waiting for 5 years. If you try to fight it, you will lose. You need to find a complementary way to position there. The third advice would be that whether it's Sievo or whether it's some other spend analysis, procurement analytics specialist, the procurement analytics challenges are relatively general across different companies and industries. So go for or look for third-party software to solve your procurement analytics challenges.
Thanks for listening to today's episode, part of our deep dive into procurement data ecosystems series in partnership with Sievo and Buyers Meeting Point. All the episodes will be available as they are published, alongside an accompanying series ebook at artofprocurement.com/data series. That's artofprocurement.com/data series.